gaming.
I would class myself as a fairly casual Resident Evil fan. I played a huge chunk of the original Resident Evil on the PlayStation 1 at a young age, but I never got to beat it. Likewise, I played a similar chunk of the GameCube remake via the Xbox One, and again, I still haven't beat it. I have not played Resident Evil 2 or 3, I have beat Resident Evil 4 a few times, Resident Evil 5 twice, I have played Resident Evil 6 but never beat it, and I have only touched on the non-numbered series but never played Revelations. Long story short, I might not have the best track record for beating Resident Evil games, but I am very aware of them, and I know a great deal on some of the characters and the general synopsis of the lore to a degree. So from the sidelines, I got to see the series decline from survival horror to third-person action games, and I didn't really give much of the games post Resident Evil 4 that much attention due to this. I sound a bit conflicted trying to explain that I do like Resident Evil as a series, but I believe I should play more and more to earn the term a fanboy. Let me get to my point. When the trailer for Resident Evil 7 was shown at E3 2016, I was instantly drawn in and thought it would be a hard reboot of the franchise. But at the same time I thought maybe it would just be a clone to that of Amnesia, PT, or even Outlast, cashing in on that trend of horror games where you are defenseless and all you can do is run from your pursuer. That's what I started to think this game was going to be. Post-launch, I eventually saw glimpses of gameplay, and I saw that your character could indeed use weapons and solve puzzles and the likes, so my interest increased. However, it would take me months and months before I decided to pick this game up, almost a full year to be exact. I had no reason at the time because there were other games I was trying to get through in 2017 and I wanted to leave Resident Evil 7 as a last resort. And well, that is sort of what I did. Resident Evil was released in January of 2017 and I got it in December, 2 weeks before Christmas to be exact. So that's enough filler talk. Let's get into my review of Resident Evil 7. Let me point out that I will not be covering any VR portion of this game because A, I do not have a PlayStation VR, and B, I played it on the Xbox One anyway. And there may be spoilers ahead, so if you have not played this game, I highly suggest you look for a spoiler-free review elsewhere. But in any case, let's get into the review now. As we all know, this game was developed and published by Capcom for the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Windows PC, and even though it appears to be set after the events of Resident Evil 6, it was unclear, as not only does it not follow any major characters from the series, it takes place within a broader setting of the same universe. So in a way, my previous theory is kind of true. It might not be a hard reboot of the series, but it is rather, at least, a soft reboot. Instead of the over-the-shoulder perspective we were so used to seeing post-Resi 4, we are now presented with the first-person perspective of a man called Ethan Winters, who goes to a plantation in Louisiana to look for his missing wife, Mia, who is presumed dead for a number of years.
All I can say is that if you get this,
Stay away.
And we later end up in this grotesque, nasty looking manor, housed by the equally nasty and even more psychotic family, the Bakers. I know I said there may be spoilers, but the less I say about these nutbags, the better.
Yes.
So let me delve into the gameplay. Resident Evil has been a fairly inconsistent type of game since it first arrived in the 90s, and to some extent has kept up with contemporary gaming tropes. It first went with a tank control scheme with heavy emphasis on puzzle solving and inventory management, as well as the camera being stationary and switching viewpoints as you navigate the area. When Resident Evil 4 arrived, it changed to an over-the-shoulder third-person perspective, giving the player much more direct control over the main character, while still somewhat keeping a tank-esque style of control. I'm sure if you played the game, you would know exactly what I meant. You still had to stop to aim and fire your gun as well. Resident Evil 6 was a much more action-orientated third-person shooter with more emphasis on the aforementioned action part. And here we are with Resident Evil 7, about 20 odd games later, once again changing up its style. This time, as I already said, opting for a first person perspective, a first in the series, borrowing elements from that of PT and Outlast as I mentioned at the beginning of the review. I believe this was a welcome change as the previous style was beginning to phase itself out, but at the same time I'm still waiting for that classic Resident Evil style that I saw in the original. Maybe that'll be satisfied once Resident Evil 2 gets remastered, and maybe Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, but I'm waffling on here. Once I jumped into the game, I originally thought the controls were very slow and very floaty, if that makes any sense. So I immediately went into the control settings and turned off camera acceleration and bumped the sensitivity all the way up to 10. Not everyone will have gotten irritated by this, and if you played it in PlayStation VR, I can't imagine you had any problems with it at all, but I digress. When I said it reminded me of PT and Outlast, that only goes for the way you control the character. Other than that, you do not have to hide, you can if you want. Nothing is necessarily hunting you save for certain recurring bosses, and you are the only one trying to escape this sickening looking house that looks like something straight out of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So you are encouraged to find weapons, be it a pistol, a shotgun, or a knife, and conserve your ammo until you really need it. At least that's what the game suggests you do. Personally, I didn't have this problem very often, especially after the first 2 hours or so. By then, the game was fairly generous in regards to the amount of ammo and supplies scattered around. This was both a good thing and a bad thing. It was nice to be able to take care of myself whenever I encountered an enemy, but it got too easy after a while. And ultimately, it took away from the terror factor. I'll talk about the scary bits in a moment, but right now I want to bring up the enemies. Aside from boss fights, there are also a new enemy called the Molded. One of them sort of reminded me of the Regenerators from Resi 4. I don't know if they're related, I'm not well up on my Resident Evil lore, but they do look similar, you have to admit that much. Unfortunately, there are only up to 4 of these enemy types I remember coming across in the base game, and I personally found it underwhelming. The first couple of encounters were frustrating, as I did struggle to keep enough ammo, but after a brief trial and error period, I was able to get past it. I didn't really have much issue from that point onwards. I will not take away from the fact that the enemies are pretty scary looking at first, especially these little shits. These guys always freaked me out due to the way they moved around. It took me aback for a brief period. It was nice that they brought back the puzzle solving elements that I remember seeing in the original games, but the problem here is that I found them a bit too simple, and there also weren't enough of them either. Since this was developed by Capcom, it surprised me that they weren't able to make these puzzles as challenging as they were originally. It didn't take too much away from my experience, but there were a few times where I completed a puzzle and said to myself, huh, was that it? It didn't feel at all satisfying, they just felt like a bit of a nuisance if I'm honest. Shooting enemies on the other hand is very satisfying. It follows the traditional Resident Evil formula in that no matter who it is you come across, aiming at the head is probably what you should do all the time, even if you somehow think that it isn't working. Even if you think that it somehow isn't working, trust me, it's working. Just aim at the head, or at the legs if you want to cripple them first, but I just went for the head. The traditional safe area with the item box and nearby tape recorder makes its return in this installment, and it really does give a sense of respite, since no enemies can follow you in here. It allows you to gather yourself before entering a potentially dangerous area and reorganise your equipment. Speaking of equipment, you can eventually find bags as you progress through the game that will increase the amount of items you can carry. I personally only found 2 or 3 of those bags, and this appeared to be enough for me. I'm not sure if there were any more than 3, but if there was, then it looks like I'd have to play through the game again to see them. Speaking of multiple playthroughs, Resi 7 is not that long of a game. It took me 8.5 hours to beat the main story, but the replay value is there. Once you beat the game for the first time, you can restart the game with a new weapon and item, and you can also choose a higher difficulty setting, which I haven't touched on as of this review, but I have heard that it's not just a higher difficulty. It remixes all the items and enemies in the game so that they aren't in their original spawn locations, and the boss battles are also slightly different too. The save sections are also different in that you cannot just save the game by going to the tape recorder. Nope, you need to have an actual tape in your possession in order to actually save the game. This isn't a bad thing either. In fact, the original Resident Evil had this in the game on boot. You had to have an ink ribbon for the typewriter that was used to save your progress. I will not spoil anything else, but I will say that playing through the game different ways and collecting all of certain items will reward you, and every reward stacks up for new playthroughs. So yes, despite the fact I did beat this game, I cannot say that I fully completed it. A lot of people complained about the game's short length, including myself at first, but I sort of see why now. It does indeed encourage you to play again and again and again in order to get the full experience. Alas, I have a short attention span and a lot of games in my backlog, so I probably won't be returning to Resident Evil 7 anytime soon, but I will return to it eventually. So let me get into the visuals now, the graphics, how the game looks. As I said earlier, Resident Evil 7 looks disgusting, but in the best possible way. It really does look horrific, and the texture details are incredible. The lighting effects absolutely work. If you want the best horror experience, I do suggest you do not turn the brightness up. Keep it exactly as the slider suggests, or even a touch lower. It really helps keep the tension up in darker areas. The fact that you're playing it from a first person perspective also helps, as you will come face to face with other characters a lot, and they all look very good. The other enemies, while generic and totally unoriginal, do look creepy as hell, and some of them did make me jump out of my skin from time to time, like those little fuckers I mentioned earlier. I have always respected Capcom for the amount of care and detail they put into their games, characters, environments, everything, and Resident Evil 7 is no exception. I found both the audio and the music to fit this game perfectly as well. The game is honestly best experienced with headphones on, I cannot stress that enough. Resident Evil 7 has one of the most eerie sound effects in a horror game I have ever heard. I also liked the music so much that I listened to the entire soundtrack on Spotify while I was in work, and I absolutely loved every piece of it from start to finish. It really sets the tone for the setting of this game. Let me briefly talk about the plot. As I said earlier, you play as Ethan in search of his wife Mia, and in the middle of looking for her, you find yourself in a house belonging to the Baker family, and the gist is basically that. There are many different twists and plot points that I will not get into, but I will say this, through story alone, this is a definite breath of fresh air for the series. Capcom really nailed that part to near perfection. Aside from some obvious copy and paste cliches that really surprised me, such as one particular character in the game that honestly made me think that she was ripped right off of Alma from the Fear franchise. I mean, come on Capcom, I've seen this before, and it only makes it much more predictable as a result. This was one of a few major gripes I had with this game, the other one being the amount of scares in the game. The beginning of the game for me was genuinely terrifying. I had sweaty palms throughout much of the first hour or two, but after a while, I adapted to the game's environment and enemies, which was slightly disappointing. Don't get me wrong, there were moments in this game that made me anxious yet again, but overall, I would say I was genuinely terrified about 30% of the time. Maybe I don't get scared at horror games as much as I used to. And, I mean, I can blast my way through Forbidden Siren and not get scared once. Well, that's what I told myself back in 2005. God knows if I tried those games again would I even be able. But once again, I digress, so let me get to my point. The game is scary. It's the scariest Resident Evil game in years. But it isn't the scariest game I have ever played. That goes to Outlast, I believe, at least in the past 10 years. I still haven't played a game scarier than that. Even PT scared the ever-living fuck out of me. I still have footage of me jumping out of my skin at this game.
Oh, it's a murder investigation? I don't know. Jesus Christ! Oh! Jesus Christ! Oh!
But look, I've tried to break this game down in detail as much as I can to justify a decent review. This is the first contemporary review I have done to this degree, aside from Limbo and Inside that I done before. So I hope I did an okay job, and I absolutely believe that Resident Evil 7 is up there as one of the best in the series. Is it worthy of being a numbered sequel? I haven't got a clue. I would happily accept this if it was called Resident Evil Baker or something daft like that. But only because none of the original characters are shown throughout the actual game itself, and seems to have tropes to that of a side story. But regardless, it's still a great game. All of things I picked at and found disappointing, they do not take away from the fun factor this game provides. It is still a wonderfully crafted horror game that the franchise desperately needed to return to, and Capcom have done exceptionally good in this regard. I might not have covered absolutely everything this game has to offer, but as I said, I haven't covered a contemporary game to this scale before, so if I was a little bit all over the place, I'll use this as a reference to improve on future contemporary reviews. I know I've been doing this for 10 years now, but I'm still learning new methods to use. In any case, that just about does it for my review of Resident Evil 7, and I hope I done it justice, as it is a brilliant horror game worthy of its title, a definite breath of fresh air for the series. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did and you want to see more, the like button is there and so is the subscribe button if you want to click it. No pressure, I do these reviews because I enjoy it. This has been Gamerboy talking to you on GB Gaming, where video games come first. Thanks again, and I'll see you soon. See you later.
Welcome to the family, son.
GB Gaming.